Alright, so we're going to talk about rational functions, and our first two objectives are going to be to find the x and y intercept, as well as determine the end behavior, or determine what the graph does as x approaches infinity and negative infinity. This is going to help us find our horizontal asymptote. We're going to be focusing on the function f of x equals 1 over x throughout this entire video. So to find our y-intercept, we know that x is going to be 0. In this ordered pair, we'll have 0, comma, and then whatever our y is. So to plug in 0 for x, we can rewrite this f of x equals 1 over x as y equals 1 over x. And then we can plug in the 0 for x, which will give us y equals 1 over 0. Well, this is undefined. So there's not actually going to be a y-intercept because whenever x is 0, y is undefined. So we know there's probably something interesting happening whenever x is 0. Well, let's try and find our x-intercept. Our x-intercept will also be an ordered pair with our x value and then a 0 for the y. So again, thinking back to this y equals 1 over x, we can plug in 0 for y. So 0 equals 1 over x. To solve for x here, we can cross multiply or multiply both sides by x. Whenever we're cross multiplying, we're going to remember that there's a 1 underneath that 0. So we're going to have x times 0 is 0, and 1 times 1 is 1. So we get 0 equals 1. Well, obviously, this is not a true statement, so there's not an x-intercept either. Which means there's something interesting going on whenever y is 0. So there's no intercepts. And we're going to need to pay attention whenever x and y get close to 0. Well, now let's try to find out what happens as x gets to become really large or really small. So as x goes to infinity and negative infinity. Well, we'll start by plugging in the x value into 1 over x. So this is the same as x and y. So now we plug in 1. We're going to have 1 over 1, which is just 1. Now we plug in 10. We'll have 1 over 10, or 1/10. We can write this in decimal form as 0.1. When we plug in 100, we're going to have 1 over 100, or 100th.01. When we plug in 1,000, 1 over 1,000 is going to be 1/1000th, or 0.001. And when we plug in 10,000, we're going to have 1/10,000th, or 0.0001. As you can see, these numbers are getting very close to 0. So a tenth to a hundredth to a thousandth to a 10,000th. And again, we haven't gotten that far. It's not that large of a number. So we can plot the points 1, 1 on our graph, as well as the other point, 10, 1/10. So we have our 1, 1, and we have our 10, 1/10. Should be right around there somewhere. So we might want to know what's happening in between these two. So if we just think about what we plug in for x, so we plugged in 1, we had 1 over 1 and got 1. If we were to plug in 2, it would be 1 over 2, or half. If we plug in 3, it'll be a third, and a fourth, and a fifth, and a sixth, and so on and so forth. So this is getting closer and closer and closer to that x-axis. So the general shape happening right here is it's going to curve down from that point 1, 1 and get closer and closer to that x-axis, or closer and closer to 0 as x gets larger and larger. Now let's look at whenever we plug in these negative large values for x. So when we plug in a -1, we're going to have 1 over -1, or -1. When we plug in a -10, we're going to have 1 over -10th, or -1/10. And then -100th, -1,000th, and -10,000th. And again, the only points we'll actually be able to plot are going to be the -1, -1, and that -10, -1/10. So as we get more and more negative, this is becoming closer and closer to 0, but it's never actually going to equal 0. So again, we won't actually touch the x-axis. So we won't have 0 for a y value. And let's plot a couple of points between this -1 and -10 to get a better idea of what's happening. So if we plug in a -2, we would have 1 over -2, or -1/2. And -1/3 if we plug in -3. -1/4 if we plug in a -4. -5 if we plug in -1/5. And so on and so forth. So we connect to try to see what this graph looks like. It's going to be very close to the x-axis as it goes to the left, and we're going to come through here to this point, -1, -1. So we have part of this graph figured out. Notice that we've already decided that we will never have a value of y equals 0, because as x gets really, really large, or really, really small, so really positive or really large negative, we're not going to actually touch 0. This is going to be a horizontal asymptote. So an asymptote is an invisible line. It's not actually part of the graph, but whenever you're graphing by hand, you want to include it. This is a guideline letting us know how our graphs are going to look. And while some functions will cross horizontal asymptotes, our functions will not. All right, now we talked about what's happening as x gets really large and really small, but let's talk about what's happening as x gets close to 0. And so it's important to note that you can approach 0 from the left and from the right sides. So I'm just going to quickly sketch our graph. And again, this is the part of the graph that we have from number 2 from the last page. Now, let's continue to look at what happens as our x values get closer to 0. So we'll start with the positive, so as x approaches 0 from the right side. And again, we know if we plug in 1 for x, 1 over 1 gives us 1. If we plug in a tenth, so 1 divided by a tenth is going to be 10. If we divide by a hundredth, we're going to get 100. 1 divided by 1,000th will be 1,000. And 1 divided by 10,000th is going to be 10,000. When we come over and look at the negative side, so approaching 0 from the left, we're going to plug in again, we've got that -1, so 1 over -1 is -1. When we plug in -1/10, we're going to have -10. When we plug in -100th, this 1 over, so 1 over -100th will be -100. 1 over -1,000 is going to be -1,000. 1 over -10,000 is going to be -10,000. So again, just to look at this and what's happening, as x gets closer and closer to 0 here, the y value is getting larger and larger. So this is going to actually end up approaching infinity. So this is from the right, so we would say as x approaches 0, and to denote that it's from the right, we're going to put a little plus sign. As x approaches 0 from the right, y is going to go to infinity. And then here, as x approaches 0 from the left, so again, we started with -1, -1/10, 100th, so on and so forth. So we're getting closer and closer to 0 from the left. So as x approaches 0 from the left, we use that little high negative sign to denote that it's from the left. Y is getting to become a very large negative number, and it's going to continue to become larger. So y is going to actually approach -infinity. So with that little bit of information, we can actually continue to draw our graph to get a really good idea of what's going on here. Now, we did have our horizontal asymptote that we had already determined from before at y equals 0. But now we can actually start to see a vertical asymptote, or see where a vertical asymptote would be. And the vertical asymptote, again, it's an invisible line, but this time it's a really good guide for drawing all functions, because your function is not going to cross a vertical asymptote. So here, whenever we have that y is going to infinity and to -infinity, This is letting us know that right down the y-axis, where x equals 0, this is where we're going to have a vertical asymptote. So we have a vertical asymptote of x equals 0. Now let's talk about if this is an even or an odd function. And again, we have f of x equals 1 over x. And so if it's even, if we plug in a negative value for an x, we're still going to get the same outcome as if we had plugged in a positive value for x. Well, we can look right above here at our little t-tables and see that that's not the case. So when we look here, and we plug in 1 for x, we get a 1 for y. Then when we plug in a negative 1 for x, we get a negative 1 for y. So we know it's not an even function. And then for an odd function, if you plug in a negative value for x, you're going to get the negative f of x. So you're going to get the negative y that you would have gotten for the positive x. And then when we look here, a positive x gives a positive y, and a negative x gives a negative y. So indeed, this is going to be an odd function. All right, let's do some fun things with these graphs. And we're going to actually start to shift these. So we're going to talk about horizontal and vertical shifts. And so for this first graph, we have the function f of x equals 1 over x plus 3. So what this is saying is that we are going to take whatever y value we got for 1 over x, and then we're going to add 3 to it.